April 23, 1945. The war in Europe had 8 days left, though nobody kneeling in that Bavarian field knew it yet. 14 German boys, their ages ranging from 12 to 16, pressed their knees into the muddy ground and waited to die. The youngest among them trembled so violently that the second-hand Wehrmacht jacket hanging from his thin shoulders seemed to flutter in a wind that wasn't blowing. Theodor Neumann, 14 years old, kept his eyes fixed on the dirt between his hands. He had been taught in Hitler Youth that American soldiers showed no mercy to captured Germans. The instructors had shown them photographs, told them stories of executions and torture. Now, listening to the heavy boots of American soldiers moving behind him, Theo believed every word. His throat felt tight, making it difficult to swallow. He wanted to be brave, to die as a soldier for the fatherland, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. To his left knelt Berthold Lang, 16, and the oldest of their group. Berthold had tried to maintain order during their chaotic surrender an hour earlier, but now his military bearing had collapsed entirely. Tears streaked through the dirt on his face, though he made no sound. He had a younger sister back in Hamburg, or at least he hoped he still did. The last letter from home had arrived 3 months ago. On Theo's right, the Hartmann twins pressed so close together they might have been trying to become one person. Konrad and Leopold, 12 years old, had been in uniform for only 6 weeks. Their mother had hidden them as long as she could, but the final desperate call-ups had found them anyway. Now Leopold's lips moved in silent prayer, while Konrad gripped his brother's hand with white-knuckled intensity. The sound of American voices carried across the field, too distant for the boys to understand the words. Theo caught fragments of English, a language that had been forbidden in school, replaced with propaganda about the decadent enemy. He heard laughter from the American lines and felt his stomach twist. Were they laughing about what they were about to do? Making jokes before the execution? Theo closed his eyes and thought of his mother. She had wept when he left for training, but she had also told him to serve with honor. Would she ever know what happened to him? Would anyone come to tell her that her son died in a muddy field, executed by the enemy she had been taught to hate? The footsteps grew closer. Theo heard the distinctive click of rifles being handled, the rustle of equipment. This was it. He tried to pray, but the words tangled in his mind. He had been so certain of everything just months ago. The righteousness of their cause, the nobility of their sacrifice, the evil of their enemies. Now, kneeling in the mud, waiting to die, he felt only confusion and a desperate longing for his mother's kitchen, for the smell of her cooking, for the impossible comfort of being a child again instead of a soldier. The boot stopped directly behind him. Theo had joined the Hitler Youth at 10 years old, the same age as every other German boy. Back then, it had seemed like an adventure. Camping trips in the Bavarian forests, learning to march in formation, singing songs around bonfires. His father had been proud, patting his shoulder and telling him he was becoming a man. That was before his father left for the Eastern Front and never came back. The training had grown more serious as the war turned against Germany. By the time Theo turned 13, the camping trips had become military drills. The songs around the fire had become lectures about sacrifice and duty. The older boys who had once taught them knots and wilderness survival disappeared one by one, sent to fight in a war that consumed everything it touched. Berthold Lang had been one of those older boys, a natural leader who took responsibility for the younger ones. At 16, he was technically still a child, but the war had stolen whatever remained of his childhood. He had watched his instructors grow more desperate, their speeches more frantic, as the Allied forces closed in from both east and west. When the final call came to defend Bavaria against the American advance, Berthold had gathered the younger boys and promised to keep them safe. He had failed. The Hartmann twins had arrived at the training facility only weeks before the collapse. Their mother had managed to hide them longer than most, claiming they were ill, moving them between relatives' homes, doing everything a mother could do to protect her children from a war that demanded them anyway. But the authorities had grown ruthless in those final months, and even 12-year-old boys were needed to fill the gaps in Germany's crumbling defenses. Konrad and Leopold had barely learned to hold a rifle properly before being issued uniforms and sent to join a ragtag defensive unit. They had no real military training, no understanding of tactics or warfare. They knew how to march and how to salute, and they had been told that dying for the fatherland was the highest honor a German boy could achieve. Now, kneeling in the mud, Theo wondered how any of them had believed it. The propaganda had been so constant, so overwhelming, that questioning it had seemed impossible. Every adult they trusted had told them the same things. Their teachers, their youth leaders, the officers who commanded them. How could they all be wrong? But they had been wrong. Theo could see that now, though the realization came too late to save him. The great cause they had been fighting for was revealed as a lie the moment their officers abandoned them 3 days ago. The older soldiers had stripped off their insignia and disappeared into the countryside, leaving the boys to face the Americans alone. Some defender of the fatherland his commander had turned out to be, running away to save himself while children held the line. The American boot behind Theo shifted in the mud. He heard the creak of leather, the clink of metal equipment. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter and waited for the end. The instructors had made certain the boys knew exactly what to expect from the Americans. Obersturmführer Keller, a scarred veteran of the Western Front, had devoted entire sessions to describing the cruelty of enemy soldiers. He had showed them photographs that he claimed depicted German prisoners being tortured. He had read them testimonials from soldiers who supposedly witnessed American atrocities. Every word had been designed to ensure that surrender would never seem like an option. Americans take no prisoners, Keller had told them during one particularly vivid lecture. They shoot surrendering soldiers on sight. If they do take prisoners, they torture them for information, then execute them anyway. Better to die fighting than to fall into their hands. Theo had believed every word. Why wouldn't he? Keller was an adult, an officer, someone who had actually fought the Americans and survived. The scar across his face seemed like proof of the enemy's brutality. The fact that Keller had disappeared along with the other officers when the Americans actually arrived had shaken Theo's faith. But the conditioning ran too deep to overcome in just 3 days. Berthold had been the one who made the decision to surrender. After the officers abandoned them, the boys had hidden in a barn for 2 days without food. On the 3rd morning, American tanks appeared on the road. Berthold had gathered the younger boys and explained their options in a voice that tried to sound steady. They could run and likely be shot. They could try to fight with their nearly empty rifles and certainly be killed, or they could surrender and face whatever came next. The twins had wanted to run. Konrad had been certain they could make it to the woods, could hide until the war ended, could somehow find their way home. Leopold had agreed with everything his brother said, as he always did. But Berthold had pointed out the machine guns on the tanks, the soldiers spreading out to search every building. Running would accomplish nothing except ensuring they died tired. So they had walked out of the barn with their hands raised, their rifles left behind, their last shreds of dignity wrapped around them like the oversized uniforms they wore. The American soldiers had shouted at them in English, words the boys couldn't understand. They had been herded into the field and ordered to kneel. The Americans had taken their few possessions, searched them roughly, then left them there while they conferred in their strange language. That had been 30 minutes ago, 30 minutes of kneeling in the mud, listening to American voices discuss their fate, waiting for the inevitable execution that their instructors had promised would come. Theo had used the time to pray, though he wasn't certain anymore who he was praying to or what he was asking for. Mercy seemed too much to hope for. A quick death seemed like the best he could expect. Behind him, the American soldier cleared his throat. Theo heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being adjusted. Lieutenant Elliot Pemberton had seen many things during his 18 months in Europe that he wished he could forget. He had seen cities reduced to rubble, refugees with nowhere to go, soldiers far too young, dying in fields that meant nothing to anyone. But standing in this Bavarian field, looking at 14 children in Wehrmacht uniforms, he felt something break inside his chest that hadn't broken yet despite everything else. The oldest couldn't be more than 16. Several looked barely into their teens. And two of them, kneeling side by side and gripping each other's hands, looked young enough to be in elementary school back home. They wore uniforms that hung off their malnourished frames like costumes in a school play. Their boots were mismatched, clearly scavenged from wherever they could be found. These weren't soldiers. These were children playing dress-up in a nightmare. Pemberton was 32 years old, a lawyer from Richmond, Virginia before the war. He had a wife named Caroline and a son named Michael who had just turned 13. Michael liked baseball and hated mathematics and was currently worried about whether Sally Henderson would agree to be his date for the spring social. Normal 13-year-old concerns, the kind of concerns these German boys should have had instead of kneeling in mud, waiting to die. His Sergeant Lyle Whitmore stood beside him, looking equally disturbed. Cookie, as everyone called him, was a farmer's son from Iowa who had volunteered the day after Pearl Harbor. He had seen heavy fighting in France, had earned a Bronze Star at St. Lo, and never complained about anything. Now he looked at Pemberton with an expression that asked a question they both already knew the answer to. "We can't just shoot children," Cookie said quietly in his flat Midwestern accent. "I don't care what uniform they're wearing. I won't do it, sir. Court-martial me if you have to." Pemberton almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Court-martial him for refusing to execute kids? The very idea was insane. But he had received orders to process all captured enemy combatants according to standard procedures, and these boys were technically enemy combatants. They had been found with weapons, wearing military uniforms, in an active combat zone. The regulations were clear. Except regulations hadn't contemplated this. Regulations assumed enemies who chose to fight, not children conscripted in a dying regime's last desperate gasps. Regulations didn't account for the boy in the middle whose shoulders shook with suppressed sobs, or the twins who looked like they might die of fear before anyone laid a hand on them. Pemberton thought about Michael back home. He thought about the letters Caroline sent describing their son's daily life, the normalcy that seemed like something from another planet. He thought about what Caroline would say if she knew he had stood in a field and processed children like enemy soldiers. She would never forgive him. More importantly, he would never forgive himself. "Sir," Cookie said again, "what are we doing here?" Pemberton made a decision that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with the fact that he was a father before he was a soldier. "Get the field kitchen set up," he ordered. Cookie Whitmore stared at his commanding officer for 3 full seconds before speaking. "Sir, you want me to cook now?" The confusion in his voice was matched by the expressions on the faces of the other soldiers who had gathered to see what would be done with the captured Hitler Youth. "That's exactly what I want," Pemberton replied. His voice carried the command authority that made men follow orders even when those orders made no sense. "Get the field kitchen operational. I want a hot meal prepared for these prisoners, something good, something that reminds them they're still human beings." The other soldiers exchanged glances. Private Raymond Nakamura, whose family had spent 2 years in Manzanar internment camp before he was allowed to enlist, stepped forward. "What kind of meal, sir? We have standard rations, some supplies we acquired in the last town." Pemberton looked at the kneeling boys again. They hadn't moved, hadn't looked up, remained frozen in their expectation of execution. He needed to break through that terror, needed to show them something their propaganda hadn't prepared them for. He needed to demonstrate that Americans could be something other than the monsters they had been taught to fear. "Cookie, what can you make with what we have? Something substantial. Something that feels like home cooking, not military rations." Whitmore's face transformed as he understood what Pemberton was attempting. The sergeant had grown up on an Iowa farm where Sunday dinners meant fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans fresh from the garden. His grandmother had taught him to cook before he was old enough to help with the harvest. The army had recognized his talent and made him a cook, a position some soldiers saw as inglorious, but which Whitmore approached with the same dedication he brought to everything else. "I can make fried chicken, sir. We liberated some birds from a farm yesterday, and I've got flour, lard, and seasonings. Won't be fancy, but it'll be real food." "Do it," Pemberton ordered. He turned to Nakamura. "Private, I want you to help. Set up the field kitchen within sight of the prisoners. Let them see what's happening. Let them hear it. Let them smell it." Nakamura's face showed understanding. He had spent 2 years behind barbed wire, being treated as the enemy by his own country simply because of his ancestry. He knew what it meant to be judged by circumstances beyond your control, to be seen as something you weren't. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I understand." The soldiers moved with purpose, bringing equipment from the trucks, setting up the portable field kitchen just 30 yards from where the boys knelt. Whitmore worked quickly, building a fire, heating the lard in a large cast-iron skillet he had carried with him since landing in Normandy. His grandmother had sent it from Iowa, insisting that no grandson of hers would eat poorly cooked food, even in a war. Theo, still kneeling with his eyes closed, heard the activity but couldn't process what it meant. The sounds were all wrong for an execution. He heard equipment being moved, metal clanking, someone stoking a fire. He risked opening his eyes just a fraction and saw American soldiers setting up what looked like a cooking station. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Why would they cook before shooting prisoners? The first thing that reached the kneeling boys wasn't a sound or a sight, but a smell. It drifted across the 30 yards separating them from the American field kitchen and hit them with the force of a physical blow. Hot fat, seasoned flour, chicken skin crisping in a skillet, the smell of cooking food, real food, not the thin soup and stale bread they had subsisted on for weeks. Theo's stomach clenched so hard it hurt. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment. The adrenaline of surrender and the terror of expected execution had suppressed his appetite completely. Now, smelling something that reminded him powerfully of his mother's kitchen on Sunday afternoons before the war, his body remembered what it meant to be fed properly. Cookie Whitmore worked with practiced efficiency, dredging chicken pieces in seasoned flour, carefully placing them in the hot lard. The sizzle was audible across the field, a sound that spoke of normalcy and comfort, of kitchens and families, and everything these boys had lost. He had learned this recipe at his grandmother's elbow, watching her feed farm workers and family with equal generosity. She had always insisted that good food was an act of love, a way of caring for people when words fell short. Theo couldn't stop himself from looking up fully now. He watched the American soldiers moving around their cooking station with casual efficiency. They weren't preparing for an execution. They were preparing a meal. The dissonance was so complete that Theo wondered if he had lost his mind, if the stress had broken something in his brain that let him interpret reality correctly. Beside him, Berthold made a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. "Are they cooking?" he whispered in German. "Why are they cooking?" The Hartman twins had both opened their eyes now, staring at the American soldiers with expressions of complete bewilderment. Leopold's lips had stopped moving in prayer. Conrad had loosened his death grip on his brother's hand slightly. They watched Private Nakamura turning chicken pieces in the skillet, the golden brown coating forming perfectly, and their 12-year-old minds struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught to expect. The smell grew stronger as the first batch of chicken finished cooking. Whitmore lifted the pieces onto a metal plate, letting the excess oil drip away, and immediately started on the next batch. He worked steadily, maintaining the perfect temperature, ensuring each piece cooked evenly. This wasn't just food. This was a message written in a language that transcended words. Theo felt tears forming in his eyes for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. The smell reminded him of everything he had lost. His mother standing at the stove in their Munich apartment, the way she would hum while cooking, the sense of safety and belonging that had existed in a world that no longer made sense. He had been so certain he would never experience anything like that again. He had been prepared to die. But now, kneeling in Bavarian mud while American soldiers fried chicken 30 yards away, he felt something crack open inside his chest that he thought had been sealed shut forever. Lieutenant Pemberton carried the first plate himself. He walked slowly across the muddy field, his boots squelching with each step, a metal plate in his hands still steaming from the heat of freshly cooked chicken. The 14 boys watched him approach with expressions that cycled through fear, confusion, and desperate hope so quickly it was painful to witness. Pemberton stopped in front of Theo and knelt down so they were at eye level. The boy flinched, anticipating a blow or worse, but Pemberton simply placed the plate on the ground between them. Up close, he could see that Theo was younger than Michael despite being only a year older. Malnutrition and stress had hollowed out his cheeks, made his eyes too large for his face. "Essen," Pemberton said, using one of the few German words he knew. "Eat." He made a gesture, bringing his hand to his mouth, ensuring the meaning was clear. The boy stared at him as if he had spoken in an alien language. Cookie Whitmore brought more plates, placing them in front of each kneeling boy with the same careful gentleness. Private Nakamura followed with canteens of water. The American soldiers worked in silence, serving children who wore enemy uniforms, treating them with a dignity that contradicted everything those children had been taught about their captors. Berthold was the first to break. The 16-year-old who had tried so hard to maintain military bearing, who had promised to protect the younger boys, who had carried the weight of leadership through their surrender, finally cracked. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at the plate in front of him. His shoulders shook with sobs he couldn't contain. This wasn't what they had promised. This wasn't what enemy soldiers did. None of the boys moved to take the food. They had been kneeling for nearly an hour now, their legs numb, their minds struggling to process a reality that contradicted their indoctrination so completely it seemed impossible. Pemberton understood their hesitation. They had been taught that Americans were brutal, that surrender meant torture and death. Kindness didn't fit into their worldview. Kindness might be a trick, a cruelty designed to give them hope before snatching it away. Pemberton reached down and picked up a piece of chicken from Theo's plate. He took a bite himself, chewing slowly, making it clear the food wasn't poisoned or tampered with. Then he placed the plate back in front of the boy and stepped away, giving him space to make his own choice. Theo's hand moved almost without his conscious decision. His fingers closed around a piece of chicken, the warmth of it shocking after weeks of cold rations. He brought it to his mouth and bit down. The taste exploded across his tongue with an intensity that made him dizzy. Seasoned, perfectly cooked, the kind of food he hadn't experienced since before his father left for the war. He began to cry while chewing. Once Theo started eating, the dam broke for the others. Berthold grabbed his plate with shaking hands and ate with the desperate efficiency of someone who had forgotten what real food tasted like. The Hartman twins ate more slowly, looking at each other between bites, as if confirming this was really happening, that they weren't hallucinating from hunger and fear. The American soldiers settled themselves on the ground nearby, not hovering over the boys, but not ignoring them either. They ate their own portions of Cookie's fried chicken, talking quietly among themselves in English. The scene should have been impossible. Enemy soldiers and captured children sharing a meal in a muddy Bavarian field 8 days before the war would end. Yet here they were. Theo forced himself to eat slowly despite his hunger. His stomach had shrunk from weeks of inadequate rations, and he knew eating too fast would make him sick. Between bites, he watched the American soldiers with fascination. They looked nothing like the monsters from the propaganda films. They looked like ordinary men, some young and some older, laughing at jokes he couldn't understand. Private Nakamura noticed Theo watching and offered a small smile. The Japanese-American soldier understood better than most what it meant to be seen as the enemy, despite being innocent. He had watched his parents lose their farm, had spent 2 years behind barbed wire in California, had joined the army partly to prove his loyalty to a country that had doubted it. Now, sitting in a German field feeding enemy children, he felt a strange sense of purpose. Cookie Whitmore walked among the boys offering seconds to anyone who wanted them. Most of them did, their hands reaching out hesitantly for additional pieces of chicken. Whitmore's face showed no judgment, only the satisfaction of a cook seeing his food appreciated. He had fed harvest crews on his family's farm, had learned that feeding people well was a form of respect, a way of saying you mattered enough to receive effort and care. The simple act of eating together began to dissolve the rigid categories that war had imposed. Enemy and friend, German and American, soldier and child. These labels started to blur as stomachs filled and the immediate threat of violence faded. Theo found himself making eye contact with Lieutenant Pemberton across the field, and for the first time since surrendering, he didn't immediately look away. Berthold leaned close to Theo and whispered in German, "Why are they doing this? What do they want from us?" His voice carried genuine bewilderment rather than suspicion. The question had no easy answer because the Americans seemed to want nothing except to feed them. Leopold Hartmann, the younger twin by 7 minutes, actually smiled as he licked chicken grease from his fingers. It was a small smile, tentative and quickly hidden, but it was there. After the meal, Lieutenant Pemberton made another decision that broke with standard prisoner processing procedures. Instead of immediately moving the boys to a holding area, he ordered his men to let them rest where they were. The boys had been kneeling for over an hour before the food arrived, and their legs would need time to recover feeling. More importantly, Pemberton wanted to give them time to absorb what had happened. Private Nakamura approached the group of boys with a canteen and a small medical kit. He knelt beside Leopold, the younger twin, who had a visible cut on his cheek, and gestured to the wound with a questioning expression. Leopold flinched but didn't pull away. Nakamura opened the medical kit and carefully cleaned the cut, applying antiseptic and a small bandage with gentle efficiency. The private worked in silence at first, focusing on his task. Then he pointed to himself and said his name slowly. "Raymond." He pointed again. "Raymond." Then he pointed to Leopold with a questioning expression. "Leopold," the boy whispered. The name came out barely audible, but it was the first word any of the boys had spoken directly to their captors beyond their initial surrender. Nakamura smiled and repeated the name, getting the pronunciation right on the second try. "Leopold, good." He moved to check Conrad for injuries, finding scrapes and bruises, but nothing serious. The twin watched him work with wide eyes, clearly expecting pain that never came. Theo observed this exchange with fascination. The American soldier treated them with the same care a doctor might show, checking for injuries without causing additional hurt, moving slowly to avoid startling them. There was no anger in his face, no contempt, just focused attention on making sure they were okay. Cookie Whitmore joined Nakamura, offering to check the boys for more serious medical issues. Several of them showed signs of malnutrition beyond simple hunger. Weeks of inadequate food had left them weak and underweight. Berthold had a persistent cough that suggested respiratory problems. Theo's hands showed early signs of frostbite from nights spent in unheated buildings. The American soldiers worked through the group methodically, treating minor injuries, making notes of more serious concerns. They moved with practiced efficiency, but without the coldness of military procedure. Each interaction seemed designed to communicate something beyond the immediate medical care. You matter. You deserve treatment. You are not disposable. Theo tried to communicate his gratitude but didn't know the English words. He settled for nodding at Cookie when the sergeant checked his hands, wrapping them in clean bandages after applying ointment to the frostbite damage. Cookie patted his shoulder and said something in English that Theo couldn't understand but whose meaning seemed clear from the tone. "You'll be okay, kid." Berthold attempted English, remembering fragments from school before English classes were banned. "Thank you," he managed, the words heavily accented but comprehensible. Cookie's face broke into a genuine smile. "You're welcome, son. Just doing what's right." The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the field. The American soldiers showed no signs of moving the boys to a prisoner facility. Instead, they began setting up a temporary camp right there. As darkness approached, Lieutenant Pemberton made an offer that would prove more significant than anyone realized at the time. He had his supply sergeant bring out clean American uniforms, oversized fatigues that would swallow the malnourished boys, but would be warmer and cleaner than the Wehrmacht remnants they wore. The boys stared at the pile of olive-drab clothing with uncertainty. Changing out of their uniforms felt like betraying something, though none of them could articulate exactly what. They had been taught that the uniform represented their service to the fatherland, that wearing it was an honor. Now that honor felt hollow, especially after their own officers had abandoned them. Berthold was the first to stand, his legs unsteady after the prolonged kneeling. He reached for one of the American uniforms and held it against himself. The jacket would hang nearly to his knees, and he would need to roll the sleeves multiple times. But it was clean, and it smelled like soap instead of mud and fear. Lieutenant Pemberton gestured toward a tent that had been set up for privacy. The boys could change there, away from observation, maintaining whatever dignity remained to them. One by one, they stood and shuffled toward the tent, their movements stiff from cold and prolonged immobility. Inside the tent, Theo began unbuttoning his Hitler Youth jacket with fingers that trembled from more than cold. He had worn this uniform with pride once, back when everything seemed clear and purposeful. Now each button felt like a question he couldn't answer. Who had he been when he put this on? Who would he be when he took it off? The twins changed quickly, eager to be rid of clothing that had marked them as targets. They helped each other with buttons and laces, their movements synchronized in the way of siblings who had learned to rely on each other completely. The American fatigues were comically large on their 12-year-old frames, but they were warm and soft and didn't carry the weight of everything they represented. Berthold folded his uniform carefully before changing, his movements precise and deliberate. He smoothed out each crease, aligned the edges perfectly, treating the discarded clothing with a respect that seemed at odds with everything that had happened. Theo watched him and understood. This wasn't about honoring the uniform itself, but about saying goodbye to who they had been, acknowledging that transformation with proper solemnity. Theo removed his own uniform and held it for a moment, feeling the rough wool against his palms. He thought about the day he received it, how grown up he had felt, how his mother had cried while telling him she was proud. He thought about everything that had happened between then and now, all the lies he had believed, all the truth he had refused to see. He folded it carefully, following Berthold's example, and set it aside. Then he pulled on the American fatigues, rolling the sleeves and pant legs until they approximated a fit. The fabric felt strange against his skin, foreign but not uncomfortable. The American soldiers built a fire as full darkness settled over the Bavarian countryside. They arranged logs in a circle around it, creating rough seating for everyone. The boys sat together on one side, still uncertain, while the Americans occupied the other. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks into the night sky. Cookie Whitmore produced a harmonica from his pocket and began playing softly. The melody was unfamiliar to the German boys, something American and vaguely melancholy. The music seemed to ease something in the air, making speech possible where before there had been only tense silence. Lieutenant Pemberton spoke first, his voice quiet, but carrying across the fire. He talked about his home in Virginia, about his wife Caroline, and his son Michael, who was 13 and loved baseball. He pulled a photograph from his wallet and passed it around the circle. The boys studied the image of a smiling American family standing in front of a white house with a porch. Theo stared at the photograph longer than necessary. The boy in the picture looked happy in a way Theo had almost forgotten was possible. He wore normal clothes, not a uniform, He stood between his parents with an expression of complete security, as if the world were a safe and predictable place. Theo tried to remember if he had ever felt that way. Private Nakamura spoke next, his story more complicated and painful. He talked about Manzanar, the internment camp, where his family had been imprisoned simply for being Japanese. He described losing their farm, being treated as enemies by their own country, and his decision to enlist anyway because he believed in American ideals even when America failed to live up to them. The boys listened with growing comprehension. This American soldier had been a prisoner too, had been judged by his ancestry rather than his actions, had experienced being labeled an enemy despite his innocence. The parallel to their own situation was impossible to miss. Cookie shared stories about his grandmother's farm in Iowa, about harvest seasons and community barn raisings where neighbors helped each other without thought of payment. He talked about his grandmother's insistence that feeding people was sacred work, that you could tell the character of a person by how they treated those who were hungry. As the Americans shared their stories, the rigid separation between the two sides of the fire began to soften. The boys leaned forward, listening with an attention that went beyond mere comprehension of words. They were hearing something their propaganda had never prepared them for. Americans were not monsters. They were people with families and stories and beliefs that sometimes included grace toward enemies. Berthold finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. He talked about Hamburg, about his younger sister who loved to draw, about his father who worked at the docks before being drafted. He talked about joining the Hitler Youth because everyone did, because it seemed normal, because he wanted to belong to something larger than himself. Theo added his own story about Munich, about his father, who never returned from the Eastern Front. The next morning brought news that shattered whatever remained of the boys' former world. Lieutenant Pemberton received updated intelligence reports from headquarters, information about the rapidly collapsing Reich and the conditions in occupied Germany. He debated whether to share this information with the boys, but decided they deserved to know what they would be returning to. He gathered them after breakfast, another meal Cookie had prepared with care. The boys sat in a semicircle, their faces showing cautious trust that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. Pemberton held papers that contained information about their hometowns, intelligence gathered from advancing Allied forces, and refugee reports. "Theo," Pemberton said gently, using the German pronunciation he had practiced. "Your city, Munich." He paused, searching for words that would be honest without being cruel. "Much of it is destroyed, Allied bombing. The reports say 70% of the buildings are damaged or gone." Theo absorbed this information with a face that tried to remain expressionless. He had known intellectually that Munich was being bombed, but knowing and understanding were different things. 70%. That meant his street, his school, his mother's apartment building, all likely gone. Where was his mother now? Was she even alive? Berthold received news that was somehow worse. Hamburg had been devastated by firebombing raids years earlier. The reports indicated that his neighborhood no longer existed, and his family's name did not appear on any survivor registries. The 16-year-old who had tried so hard to protect the younger boys now faced the possibility that he had no one left to protect, no family waiting for his return. The Hartmann twins learned that their mother had registered with the Red Cross as displaced from their village, which now sat in what would become the Soviet occupation zone. She was alive, somewhere in a refugee camp, but the village itself had been abandoned during the fighting. Their home, the only place they had ever known, was now part of a contested territory being absorbed into a foreign power's control. Each piece of news landed like a physical blow. The boys had clung to the idea of home as something solid, a place they could return to when this nightmare ended. Now they learned that home had been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition while they played at being soldiers. Private Nakamura sat with Leopold, who had begun crying silently after learning about his mother's displacement. The private didn't try to offer false comfort or empty reassurances. He simply sat beside the 12-year-old and let him cry, occasionally patting his shoulder with awkward gentleness. Cookie brought Berthold a cup of coffee, strong and hot, and sat with him while the teenager stared at nothing. The news about Hamburg had broken something fundamental in Berthold's sense of self. He had endured everything believing his sister needed him to survive, to come home. Now he might have no sister to return to, no home to shelter her in. Theo felt a strange numbness spreading through his chest. His mother might be dead. His home was destroyed. Over the following days, as the boys recovered physically under American care, the question of their future grew increasingly urgent. Standard procedure dictated that prisoners of war should be processed through official channels and eventually repatriated to their home country. But everything about this situation defied standard procedure, and the boys themselves began to realize they faced an impossible choice. Lieutenant Pemberton sat with them on the third day and tried to explain their options as honestly as he could. His German was limited, so Private Nakamura helped translate the nuances. The boys listened with expressions that cycled between hope and despair as they began to understand the magnitude of what confronted them. "You can return to Germany through official channels," Pemberton explained. "You would be processed as displaced persons, given papers, and transported to refugee centers in the American occupation zone. From there, you could try to locate family members or be placed in youth facilities until other arrangements could be made." The boys exchanged glances. Youth facilities sounded like orphanages, which is what they would be if their families were dead. Refugee centers meant camps, temporary housing, uncertainty stretching indefinitely into a future none of whom them could imagine clearly, or Pemberton continued, and his voice carried a weight that made them all pay closer attention. In certain circumstances, with proper sponsorship and documentation, young people can emigrate to the United States. It is not easy. It requires American families willing to sponsor you, extensive paperwork, approval from multiple agencies, but it is possible. The word possible hung in the air like a question none of them knew how to answer. America, the enemy country that had turned out not to be their enemy at all. The place where soldiers fed you fried chicken instead of executing you, where people treated you with dignity despite the uniform you wore. Theo thought about Munich in ruins, about the 70% of buildings destroyed, about trying to find his mother in that chaos. He thought about what kind of Germany would emerge from this defeat, what opportunities would exist for boys who wore enemy uniforms, even briefly. Then he thought about Lieutenant Pemberton's photograph, about the smiling boy who looked so secure in his world. Berthold faced an even starker choice. With no confirmed family remaining, returning to Hamburg meant facing complete uncertainty alone. He was 16, technically almost an adult, but he felt decades older after everything that had happened. Could he rebuild a life in ruins by himself? Should he even try? The twins had the clearest path forward since their mother was alive and searching for them through Red Cross channels. But even they felt torn. Their village was gone, absorbed into Soviet territory. Their mother was in a camp somewhere. What kind of life awaited them there? Cookie Whitmore spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. "Boys, nobody's rushing you to decide. Take your time. Think about what you really want." While the boys grappled with their impossible choice, the American soldiers continued treating them with a kindness that made the decision both easier and harder. Each small gesture of care added weight to the possibility of staying, of choosing America over a Germany that no longer existed in the form they remembered. Cookie Whitmore invited Theo to help prepare breakfast on the fourth morning. The sergeant showed him how to mix batter for pancakes, explaining the proportions in a combination of broken German, hand gestures, and demonstration. Theo watched with intense focus as Cookie worked, noting how the consistency should look, how to test the griddle temperature with drops of water. When Theo flipped his first pancake successfully, Cookie clapped him on the shoulder and grinned. "Natural talent," he said in English. Theo didn't need translation to understand the approval in his voice. For the first time in months, Theo felt pride in accomplishing something that had nothing to do with war or survival. Just the simple satisfaction of learning a skill from someone who cared enough to teach it. Private Nakamura worked with the Hartman twins on writing letters to their mother through the Red Cross network. The twins' literacy was basic, their education interrupted by war, so Nakamura helped them compose messages that would reach the refugee camps. Leopold dictated while Conrad wrote, their words tumbling over each other in eagerness to tell their mother they were alive and safe. The private's own experience with separation from family made him particularly patient with the process. He helped them understand that responses would take weeks, that the mail system was chaotic, that they needed to be patient, but he also assured them that the Red Cross was effective, that their message would likely reach their mother eventually. Lieutenant Pemberton spent time talking with Berthold about practical matters. The 16-year-old had leadership qualities that Pemberton recognized and wanted to nurture rather than see wasted. They discussed possibilities for education, for learning trades, for building a future that looked forward rather than backward. "I wrote to my wife," Pemberton told Berthold through Nakamura's translation. "I told her about you boys, about what happened here. Caroline teaches at a school in Richmond. She has connections with families who might be willing to sponsor young people from Europe. It is not a promise, but it is a possibility." Berthold felt something shift in his chest at those words. A teacher, school, the chance to learn something beyond warfare and survival. He had been good at mathematics before the war interrupted everything. He had imagined once, in what felt like another lifetime, studying engineering at university. That dream had seemed permanently dead when Hamburg fell. Now, impossibly, it flickered back to life. The boys began taking on small responsibilities around the camp without being asked. Theo helped Cookie with meal preparation. The twins assisted with cleaning and organization. Berthold started teaching basic German to interested American soldiers, creating informal language lessons that benefited both sides. On the 7th day of their captivity that no longer felt like captivity, Lieutenant Pemberton made a decision that would change everything again. A liberated concentration camp lay 15 miles from their position, and Pemberton believed the boys needed to see it. They needed to understand what their country had done, what they had unknowingly served by wearing those uniforms. The boys climbed into the back of an American truck with expressions of confusion. They had been told only that they were going to see something important, something that would help them understand the war they had been part of. Private Nakamura rode with them, his face grave in a way they hadn't seen before. The smell reached them before they could see anything. A stench so overwhelming that Leopold vomited over the side of the truck. The other boys covered their faces, but the odor penetrated everything, death and decay, and something worse, something that spoke of systematic horror beyond comprehension. Pemberton stopped the truck at the gates. The camp had been liberated 2 weeks earlier, but bodies still awaited burial. The survivors who could walk had been evacuated to hospitals, but evidence of what had happened here remained everywhere. Barracks designed for 50 people that had held 300, crematoria that had run day and night, mass graves barely covered with earth. A military chaplain met them at the entrance, a man whose face showed the strain of ministering to horrors that challenged faith itself. He had volunteered to guide visitors through the camp, believing that witnessing was a form of testimony, that people needed to see what had been done in darkness. The boys walked through the camp in silence. Theo saw the scratches on the walls where fingernails had clawed at concrete. He saw the ovens where bodies had been burned. He saw photographs that American soldiers had found, documentation the SS had kept of their systematic murder. His legs gave out halfway through, and he fell to his knees and vomited until nothing remained in his stomach. Berthold couldn't stop apologizing. He repeated the word in German over and over, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. We didn't know." But even as he said it, he wondered if that was entirely true. There had been whispers, rumors that people dismissed as enemy propaganda. There had been questions about where the Jewish families in their neighborhoods had gone. There had been signs they had all chosen not to see. Conrad and Leopold held hands and wept, their 12-year-old minds unable to fully process the magnitude of what they were witnessing. They had been taught that Germany was defending civilization, that their enemies were the real monsters. Now they stood in a place that revealed the monstrous truth about what they had been defending. The chaplain spoke quietly about what had happened here, not just at this camp, but at dozens of others. Millions of people murdered systematically, industrially, with the efficiency that Germans had once taken pride in applying to everything. Jews, Roma, political prisoners, disabled people, anyone the Reich deemed unworthy of life. Lieutenant Pemberton watched the boys confront this reality and felt his heart break for them. They were children who had been lied to completely, who had served evil while believing they served good. The betrayal was total. That night, back at their camp, nobody could eat the dinner Cookie had prepared. The boys sat around the fire in silence, their faces reflecting horror that had settled into their bones. The world they thought they understood had been revealed as a lie, built on atrocities they couldn't have imagined. Theo spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. How do we live with this? How do we go forward knowing what we were part of? He wasn't asking the Americans, he was asking the universe, asking God if God still existed after what they had seen. Lieutenant Pemberton let the question hang in the air for a long moment before responding. You live with it by choosing differently now. You were children who believed lies adults told you. That doesn't erase what happened, but it means you have a choice about what happens next. You can let this knowledge destroy you, or you can let it transform you into people who ensure nothing like this ever happens again. Berthold looked at the lieutenant with red-rimmed eyes. I wanted to be an engineer once. I wanted to build things, create things that would last. Now, I feel like everything I could build would be tainted by what my country did, by what I served, even if I didn't understand what I was serving. Private Nakamura moved closer to the fire, his face thoughtful. My family lost everything because of fear and prejudice. Our farm, our home, our place in our community. The government that imprisoned us was wrong. But I chose to serve that government anyway, not because I agreed with what they did to my family, but because I believed in what America could be, what it should be. Maybe Germany can become something different too, but only if people like you choose to make it different. The words settled over the group like a benediction. The boys sat with them, testing their weight, considering their implications. They were being offered something rare and precious. The chance to choose who they would become, to define themselves by their future actions rather than their past associations. Cookie spoke up, his Iowa practicality cutting through the philosophical weight. You boys are 14, 16, 12 years old. You've got your whole lives ahead of you. What happened was evil, and you need to remember that and never forget it. But you also need to understand that you can spend your lives making amends. Building instead of destroying, helping instead of hurting. Being the kind of men who would never let something like this happen again. Theo felt something shift inside him as he listened. The guilt would never leave him completely. He would carry the knowledge of what his country had done for the rest of his life, but maybe, just maybe, he could carry it forward into something that mattered. Maybe he could become someone his mother would be proud of, not for wearing a uniform, but for choosing humanity over hatred. 3 weeks after their surrender, official decisions needed to be made. The American military bureaucracy had finally caught up with Lieutenant Pemberton's unauthorized custody of 14 German boys, and forms needed to be completed. Futures needed to be determined. The boys who had knelt in a muddy field expecting execution now faced the reality of choosing what came next. The Hartman twins received word first. The Red Cross had located their mother in a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt. She was alive, healthy, and desperately searching for her sons. The relief on Conrad and Leopold's faces was profound, but it was mixed with something more complicated. They would be leaving the American soldiers who had shown them kindness, leaving the strange sanctuary they had found in captivity. Lieutenant Pemberton arranged their transport personally, ensuring they would travel safely through the chaotic landscape of defeated Germany. On their last morning, Cookie made them a final breakfast of pancakes and eggs, teaching them one last time how to flip the pancakes just right. The twins practiced solemnly, as if committing the skill to memory along with everything else they needed to remember about this place. Berthold's path proved more complex. With no confirmed family and his hometown in ruins, repatriation meant entering the displaced person system alone. But Lieutenant Pemberton's wife, Caroline, had written back with unexpected news. A family in Richmond, the Hendersons, had expressed interest in sponsoring a German youth. They were Quakers with a long history of humanitarian work, and they believed in offering second chances to young people caught in circumstances beyond their control. The paperwork would take months. Berthold would need to remain in American custody, probably transferred to a displaced persons facility, while the immigration process ground forward. But the possibility existed. A teacher named Margaret Henderson had written directly to Berthold, her letter translated by Private Nakamura, expressing her belief that education could heal the wounds of war and that her family wanted to help him continue his studies. Theo faced the most difficult decision. His mother might still be alive in Munich, somewhere in the 70% of the city that remained. The Red Cross had not confirmed her death, but they also had not located her among the survivors they had registered. He could return and search for her, spend months or years trying to find her in the chaos, or he could accept that she might be gone and choose a different future. Lieutenant Pemberton had made inquiries on Theo's behalf as well. His own sister lived in Georgia with her husband, and they had a farm that could use help. They were willing to sponsor Theo if he chose to come to America, to give him a chance to learn farming and eventually attend school. It wasn't a guarantee of anything except opportunity, but opportunity felt like more than Theo had any right to expect. The night before the twins departed, all 14 boys gathered around the fire one last time. They had been together for less than a month, but that month had contained more transformation than some people experienced in entire lifetimes. 30 years later, Theodor Neumann stood in a Bavarian field that looked nothing like he remembered. The mud had been replaced by grass. The trees had grown tall and healthy. The war's scars had healed on the landscape, even if they remained visible in other ways. He had brought his own children with him, 2 daughters and a son, all born in America, all carrying the complicated heritage of a father who had been both victim and participant in history's darkest chapter. Sarah, his oldest at 14, the same age her father had been when everything changed, asked the question he had known was coming. "Dad, is this really where it happened? Where the American soldiers fed you instead of shooting you?" Theo nodded, his eyes scanning the field as if he could still see the ghost images of American soldiers setting up their field kitchen, of Lieutenant Pemberton carrying that first plate, of 14 terrified boys learning that everything they believed was wrong. "This is where I learned that enemies could become friends, that kindness was more powerful than hatred, that people could choose who they wanted to become regardless of who they had been." He had become an architect, as he had told himself he would that night around the fire. He specialized in churches, particularly those that fostered German-American cooperation and understanding. His firm had rebuilt structures destroyed in the war, but more importantly, it had created new spaces designed specifically to bring former enemies together in shared purpose. Berthold had written to him faithfully over the decades. The Hendersons had sponsored him as promised, and he had eventually earned a degree in social work. He spent his career helping displaced children, understanding their trauma from the inside, using his own experience to guide others through impossible circumstances. His letters always ended the same way, with gratitude for Lieutenant Pemberton and Cookie Whitmore and Private Nakamura, all of whom had shown him that redemption was possible. The Hartman twins had found their mother and rebuilt their lives in Germany. They had become teachers, both of them, dedicating themselves to ensuring that future generations understood what had happened and why it must never happen again. They visited Theo in America every few years, and the bond forged in that muddy field remained unbroken despite the decades and distance. Theo's son Michael, named for Lieutenant Pemberton's boy, picked up a handful of dirt and let it run through his fingers. "Grandpa," he said, using the title for the lieutenant who had passed away 5 years earlier, but who had remained a presence in Theo's life until the end. Grandpa Pemberton always said you were the bravest person he knew, that it took more courage to change than to stay the same. Theo felt tears forming, but didn't try to hide them. Lieutenant Pemberton had attended Theo's wedding, had been present at the births of all 3 children, had become family in a way that transcended legal documents or national boundaries. His final letter, written when he knew he was dying, had released Theo from any remaining sense of debt or obligation. "You don't owe me anything," it had said. "You took the chance we offered and built something beautiful. That's all any of us can hope to do."